Okay, well, I think we'll make a start. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a nice audience today. Welcome to today's Grand Round. I'm Trevor Duke, and Grand Rounds is coming to you live from the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. Now, to begin with today, and even more importantly today at Grand Rounds, we acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and their neighbours, the Boonwurrung people, as the traditional owners on the land on which our hospital was built, and we pay our respects to their elders, their community values and cultures, including their ongoing spiritual connection to the land and their right to sovereignty and self-determination. Now, the theme of racism and its effects on health is an important and timely one. Firstly, it's Harmony Week in Australia, and there's been much commentary this week about whether the rebranding of the UN's International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination somehow whitewashes important aspects of our history despite celebrating other aspects. And I think secondly, you might want to follow this up, but racism was the topic of a leading article this week in the Australian Medical Journal, a very good article in which it described the effects of racism on Indigenous people's social and emotional well-being, their mental and physical health, and the lack of a legal framework to protect what are fundamental human rights. So we welcome our speakers of courage today to explore this uncomfortable topic. Professor Naomi Priest is a social epidemiologist. She's the group leader of social biological research at the Centre for Social Research and Methods at the Australian National University, which is co-located here at MCRI. Professor Priest also holds an honorary position at the School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. Now, Naomi has extensive experience in qualitative mixed methods and large-scale quantitative research, especially related to child and adolescent health and health inequalities. Her research program analyses how social forces and social exposures become biologically embedded and their effects on inequalities in health and development. And much of this work focuses on mental and cardiovascular disease for children and adolescents from Indigenous backgrounds and ethnic minorities. Our second speaker will be Kate Dowry. Kate is a research officer in the same research group working with Naomi. Kate holds an honorary position at the Centre for Community Child Health also at MCRI. She has a Masters of Culture, Health and Medicine from ANU, and her current research focuses on exploring young people's experience of racism and discrimination, effects of these experiences, and on co-designing anti-racism strategies. The third speaker will be Alexander Lee. Alex is a PhD student in sociology and a research assistant at Deakin University with the Centre for Multicultural Youth. Her research interests include youth futures, race and racism, embodiment, and youth participation. And our fourth speaker will be Kano Ravalji. Kano Ravalji, welcome Kano. Is an award-winning youth and multiculturalism advocate who empowers young people from multicultural backgrounds to find their voice and have confidence in themselves. And Kano is rather famous on social media, and he's actually actively engaged in the community and regularly advises on policy to ensure it is culturally appropriate and inclusive of young people's needs. So please give a big warm welcome to Professor Naomi Priest to start today and all the other speakers. Thanks.
Thanks, Trevor, for that lovely welcome. And yeah, thanks to the team for coming and joining us today. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are on unceded Aboriginal land and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that we're on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd also like to pay my respects and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here in the room today or who are watching online. We do have an apology from our Aboriginal colleagues who are not able to make it today because of illness, but we've got a video that they've been involved in putting together that we'll hopefully get time to show at the end. Here we go. So Trevor's given a fabulous introduction. Yesterday was Harmony Day, and there's been quite a lot of discussion in the media this year, more than I've ever seen actually, reminding us that this was a really powerful rebrand by the Australian government a couple of decades ago of this International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which was actually first commemorated, not celebrated, commemorated to recognise a massacre by police of a peaceful protest against apartheid. So it actually has a very emotional, I think, and powerful beginning. But I think we are seeing a big change in the public discourse in Australia around actually being able to name and talk about racism. And I think that's a really important one. So fantastic to be here today talking about racism in the context of health. And of course, this is a conversation that First Nations people have been having since colonisation. It's taking us a little while in the medical and the mainstream media community to catch up. This is from the Uluru Statement. And of course, a really significant issue in Australia, a topic for Australia's history as we think about the referendum coming up this year. And this quote from the Uluru Statement reminds us that proportionally we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are aliened from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them and our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. So in much more recent years, the pervasiveness, the powerful nature of racism as a fundamental cause of health and health inequalities has been recognised by the mainstream medical and health community, particularly driven by the COVID pandemic and the concurrent Black Lives Matter movement in the US that then disseminated throughout the world, including here in Melbourne. So we've got here statements from the British Medical Journal. Fiona Godley wrote this editor, calling racism the other pandemic. The Lancet called racism the public health crisis we can no longer ignore, which we've borrowed in our talk title for today. And the CDC in the States put out a statement saying racism is a serious threat to public health. And of course, as I said before, this is what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been saying for a very long time. At the same time, acknowledgement that racism was also a particular issue for children and young people, again, led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Colleagues and I had a piece in the MJA Insight, and Vic Health also put out a rapid evidence review that we were involved with. In late 2019, just before the start of the pandemic, the American Academy of Pediatrics released this excellent policy statement highlighting the impact of racism on child and adolescent health, including some key strategies for pediatricians and those working in child health to address racism. And I'm going to speak to some of those a bit later, but they make this statement: the conventional designation of race or ethnicity as a risk factor for disparities in health or inequalities in health, which is very much how the discourse has often been, diverts critical attention away from systemic racism, other structural inequities, and their deep historical roots as pernicious influences on the intergenerational transmission of stress-related disease. In late 2022, some of you may know of Jack Shonkoff and his seminal work on toxic stress and the way in which early life adversity gets under the skin to influence health and wellbeing throughout life. He, with colleagues of mine, Natalie Slopin and David Williams, all at Harvard, put out this excellent review in the annual review of public health. And they say the challenge facing the public health community is to focus greater attention at a societal level on the essential need to confront the pathogenic influences of structural and cultural racism through an early childhood lens. And of course, here, I want to mention another Harvard professor, Dr. Nancy Krieger, who's a very well-known social epidemiologist who many of you will know, and she reminds us that we don't study the impacts of racism and health to prove that racism is bad. Racism is a breach of human rights, as yesterday, the international, and this whole week, the International Day for Elimination of Racial Discrimination. There are UN conventions on elimination of racial discrimination. We don't study racism to prove it's bad, but we study racism to understand how it contributes to population health and health inequities and identify where we should be targeting interventions. So what do we mean by racism? If you go on social media or if you go on any talk show, of course, we know this is debated, usually by white people, what is and isn't racism. This is the definition that we use in our work. Excuse me. Racism fundamentally is an ideology, and it's an organized system of oppression. And it's this system that categorizes and ranks social groups into races. So racism creates race, not the other way around. So race exists not as a biological reality. We don't have time to go into all of the genetics and the data from the Human Genome Project and elsewhere. Human genetic variation does not map onto the racial and ethnic categories that we use today. So it's not a biological reality, but it's a socio-political reality. It's a very powerful predictor of who has access to opportunities, who has access to resources, and also who faces risks and barriers. When we talk about racism, we have to talk about the both sides of the coin. This is about both privilege and oppression, about advantage and disadvantage. And so race and racism profoundly shape health and health risks and opportunities, particularly for children and young people. And of course, this has consequences throughout life and across generations. For children and young people, many of us, that's why we're here at the Children's Hospital and working with children and young people. We know that early life experience and exposures, this is some of Jack Shonkoff's work, it does get under the skin. It becomes biologically embedded to influence later outcomes because of the sensitive period of their brain development, the developing bodies, and the impact that that has throughout life. We also know, I'm sure some of you here are working in adolescence. The adolescence is also a peak time of biological change, but also of social role change. And the way those two intersect means that experiences of racism in adolescence can have really powerful and long-lasting effects. And this is from some of the life course epidemiologists who think about the life course nature of racism, that these early and ongoing socially patterned risks and opportunities, of course, then lead to these health advantages and disadvantages that we mentioned. So the age and time are not just biologically and developmentally significant, but they're socially significant in terms of the context in which children and young people, at a certain age, you might be more in the family or more in school or more out in the community, and that also interacts with your biology as well. And of course, again, from life course epidemiology, from Geronimus, and she's talked about the weathering effect. Some of you might have heard the image that she uses of this accumulation of adversity or accumulation of risk factors, a bit like being, I think if you think of the concept of two different houses, one in a very sheltered spot, away out of the weather, protected, that building is going to last a lot longer than a building that's out in the storm being buffeted and blown about in the storm and the assaults of all these forms of stress. It's going to break down. And so that analogy is called the weathering effect. So for racism, children and adolescents, as I said, children and young people are particularly vulnerable, and this happens in multiple complex and reinforcing ways. Racism harms children and youth health through both structural, societal and institutional level, as well as through direct exposure. So when we're talking about the structures, the systems, the institutions, the way in which our society is set up to advantage essentially those who are white, those who are in power, and disadvantage others. And that might be historical and contemporary racism for communities, families and carers, in the way they can even access resources and opportunities needed for health, as well as the direct exposure to racism, and racism as a form of psychosocial stress and stressor exposure, but also as a driver of increased levels of other forms of stress. Some quick examples of structural racism that many of you will know about: the tragic racialised attack and eventual murder of Cassius Turvey in Perth, and the associated and ongoing justice and policing issues around that, terribly tragic. Some of you might know about the inquest into Naomi Williams's tragic death, and the coronial. It's difficult reading, but would encourage you to read the coronial findings from that, and very clear identification of systemic racism in the way that she was treated and discharged despite sepsis. Another really strong example of structural racism and the ongoing legacies of colonisation is the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care, including notifications and removal of children even before, they're not removed before birth, but the notification before birth and then children being removed very early. You can see here on this graph that's in a position paper led by Kath Chamberlain, who's a Palawa woman and Professor of Indigenous Health at Melbourne Uni. This is from the AIHW, showing the Close the Gap target is the very grey line right at the bottom. And you can see that the trend, if we continue on the current way, this is the top line for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, showing how much work needs to be done if we are to close that gap. At an interpersonal level, these are data from some work that I led in the Speak Out Against Racism survey, one of the first population representative surveys of school children and their experiences of interpersonal discrimination, so racial discrimination from peers, teachers, and in wider society. And in this survey, 50% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and youth reported, who were 10 to 15, reported experiencing racism, 43% from their peers, 20% reported racism from their teachers, and nearly 40% from wider society, and nearly 70% reported witnessing racial discrimination. For ethnic minoritized youth, interestingly, there were higher levels of reporting from ethnic minoritized between, as I said, between 58 and 68%, depending on the different groups, and similarly high levels of vicarious discrimination. One of the people often surprised how come the Aboriginal kids are reporting less. One of the suggestions is that it's become, oh, we haven't moved the slide along. Or it has moved for me. Is that what happened, Kate? It's being too clever, it's jumped along. Sorry, it's become so normalised for Aboriginal kids to have these experiences that they're not reporting. That was the feedback that we had from community. So in terms of the health impacts of racism, this is a systematic review that we did a number of years ago, and we're now updating, almost there. But the evidence, there's really strong evidence across cross-sectional and longitudinal cohorts. A lot of the data is from the US, although we are starting to build up the same a body of evidence here in Australia as well, that children and young people who have these direct experiences of racial discrimination, it impacts on their mental health across a whole range of outcomes: anxiety, depression, behaviour problems, substance use and suicide risk, suicidality, as well as chronic disease risk factors. We've done a small amount of that work here, but showing associations between experiences of racial discrimination and inflammatory markers, obesity risk, epigenetic aging, sleep, and cortisol reactivity. And so that's something I'm really interested in, actually, around the extent to which these experiences might be contributing to the chronic disease burden we see amongst Indigenous and other minoritized groups. There's also a lot of work now focusing on the impacts of vicarious experiences. So whether it's a carer experiencing racism, whether it's witnessing racism, whether at school or on the media, and the impact that that has on children and young people. So there's quite a lot of evidence, particularly from the states, showing that these vicarious exposures are associated with a low birth weight, being small for gestational age, with increased risk of childhood illness, mental health and behaviour problems, often through the pathway. Of course, if a carer has these experiences, they're more likely to have a mental health challenge that then has associated flow-on effects to their children. This is a new paper that came out at the end of last year that I was a co-author on, led by Professor Ray Lovett, who's an Aboriginal social epidemiologist at the ANU, and Katie Thurber was the first author. This is in the Lancet, and this is a fantastic paper that they led using the Maikawai study, which is the first Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander national study of health and wellbeing. And so they used population attributable fractions among adults, and we're using some different methods to quantify the contribution of racism to child health inequalities. So you have to watch this space. But they found that overall, nearly half of the total psychological distress burden amongst Indigenous adults could be attributable to everyday discrimination, and 30% of that to racial discrimination. They also found, we're thinking about the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, that everyday racial discrimination could explain nearly half of the overall gap. This is just interpersonal discrimination. This is just the tip of the iceberg, really, in terms of the overall burden of racism. Super aware of the time here. I've got, what, 4 minutes left before these guys are on. So what do we do about it? Obviously, wicked problems need wicked solutions. Complex problems need complex solutions. Talking about it, of course, is the first step. So often, As we've seen with Harmony Day, we don't like talking about the R word. So naming racism and addressing it explicitly at a systemic and an institutional level is critical, and don't underestimate the power of that. But also in terms of interventions, too often we see interventions in a policy, in a health, in an education space, focused on addressing the disadvantage and not actually on addressing racism. So it might, it's not that addressing poverty or addressing educational outcomes is a bad thing. That absolutely needs to happen, but we also need to be directly addressing racism itself. We absolutely, anti-racism efforts need to be done in an anti-racist way, right? So they need to be directed by and working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, focusing on sovereignty and leadership, and actively involving community cultural groups and children and young people. And I know some of our speakers are going to talk about this in a bit more detail. It needs to be life course appropriate. I talk about this a lot when I'm working with teachers and in schools. And it kind of makes intuitive sense, but it's an important reminder that the way, of course, we talk about racism or do anti-racism work, the way we do that with a preschooler or with an adolescent is, of course, going to be really different. And there is a real risk of harm, of reinforcing stereotypes and causing distress. So we do need to take care and consider the developmental needs and the needs of particular community cultural groups. And of course, we need to cite the experts, whether they're the academic experts, the community leaders, and the great work that's come before, standing on the shoulders of giants. So what can we do? These are some key pointers from this statement from the Academy of Pediatrics in the US. The first one, I think, is one for all of us, and not just as healthcare providers, but in the everyday community as well. Be prepared to discuss racism and the impacts that it has, whether it's a direct, vicarious or systemic exposures. Do some reading, watch some videos, do what you need to do to be able to have these conversations with children and families, including in a clinical setting. And part of that is also ensuring all children and families know that they are welcome in healthcare settings and that they're going to be treated fairly, no matter where they come from, and that will receive high quality care. And I know our speakers are going to come to this point and talk about how the healthcare system is perceived by many multicultural young people. And of course, to do this, we all need to be examining our own and continuing to examine our own biases, assumptions as individuals, as well as consider how our healthcare system and practices needs to be reoriented. We also need to be advocates, advocating for community initiatives. We know that a lot of health happens outside of the healthcare system. So continuing to advocate for initiatives in health, justice and education to address racism. Creating cultural safe healthcare spaces is critically important. And again, where providers can acknowledge and are sensitive to racism that children and families experience, it might be strengthening how we have patient and family-centered communication strategies, including screening tools that actually capture and ask children and families about experiences of racism, and of course doing that in a careful way with communities. And providing support, and of course this depends on the clinical setting. We do some of this work in schools, actually supporting children and family to develop their racial literacy, their racism literacy, so that they can recognise racism, they have the language to talk about it, they can differentiate racism from other forms of unfair treatment, and have some strategies to safely oppose it, whether they themselves are the target or they're a bystander. I mean, we all need to do really. If you're involved in clinical care, be great to be aware of this work, particularly led out of the States. And I know some of these conversations are happening here, for example, in the kidney space and in the cardiovascular adult space, but addressing racial bias in clinical algorithms. This was just in JAMA Pediatrics this week. Some of you might have seen some new evidence about the inaccuracy of pulse oximetry in children with black skin that actually overestimates the oxygen saturation. I'm not a clinician. I used to be an OT, but this is not what I do, but pretty serious if this is overestimating the amount of oxygen they have. And there's a whole lot of discussion happening about taking race out of these clinical algorithms, because it's actually meaning that children are getting inequitable care. For research, we also need to be, there's two brand new guidelines. This one on my right is from the National Academies of Science. It just came out last week with some very helpful guidance about using population descriptors, should we or should we not be using race and ethnicity in genetics and genomics research? I'd really commend that to you, and I actually think it's helpful for anyone, even if you're not in genetics and genomics research. But we need, particularly in Australia, where we don't routinely report these data, to collect and report race and ethnicity data, but do it in a way that, again, with communities. And of course, report data on racism as well.
Code Grey Hills Building, Level 1, Banksia, ICA space. Code Grey Hills Building, Level 1, Banksia, ICA space.
We need to be collecting and reporting data on racism and other related stresses. And of course, this all needs to be grounded on meaningful and respectful relationships with communities. So that's enough from me. And now I'm going to hand over to Kate, Kano, and Alex to talk about their work where they've put some of this in practice.
So thanks, Naomi, for covering off on a lot of the academic research. A lot of our work prioritizes giving voice to people and making sure that people who are impacted by these experiences, their voices are heard and they're reflected in the research. So I'm coming at this as a person without this as a lived experience. I'm here to support people with these experiences, but acknowledge that to get me, myself, I don't have these lived experiences. So last year, Kano, Alex, myself, and another peer researcher, we conducted some focus groups with multicultural Victorians. We had 56 participants aged 16 to 27 participating in some focus groups. We really wanted to make sure that we were giving people a voice and they could share their stories in a safe and respectful space. Lots of our participants actually reflected at the end of their focus groups that they were really grateful for us being there, letting them share in a way that they had never been able to be able to share before. We made sure that people could participate in any way that they wanted to on the chat or without their video. So really encouraging people to share and be open with their experiences. This project was designed as a peer with our peer researchers, and as a project that was not designed to put the burden back on solving racism back onto community, but as a way to hear their stories and hear what young people want to be, how to be supported through their experiences. It was really important to make sure that it was co-designed and really had that youth voice front and center. And I think it's something that is often missed in research and in this space. We noticed at the start of COVID, we did a survey of multicultural young people, and it was the only survey early in 2020 that preferenced voices of multicultural young people. Often the surveys were of just the general population or of white communities, and we were the only ones to ask about their experiences of racism and discrimination. And Alex will show some of those results later. So we're just going to share some of our key quotes and some of our key findings. So we really found that young people have a strong understanding of what racism is and the impact it's having on them and their families and the extended experiences that it has throughout their life course. Young people could express that racism is a systemic issue and is impacting not just them as an interpersonal experience, but really embedded into a lot of our systems and structures. This person said that, they could clearly name that here. And we also heard from people that they could articulate that racism is this kind of shift in events, and you get attention to one thing or the other, and we're not really talking about it as a big problem. First of all, we talk about it as COVID, it was only impacting Asian Australians, which wasn't really the case, or we're talking about it impacting on Southeast Asian students or African gangs. They could really clearly articulate that one group is getting this attention, and it kind of diminishes the impact that they might have if they're not from that group. We also spoke about people's experiences during COVID, and young people could clearly see that it was a global issue, not just an issue impacting people in Australia. They could clearly see that, they were hearing people, Blacks dying at different rates due to COVID. And young people, this was a really key quote, that lots of people saw that racism was continuing through generations. It was learnt from their parents and their grandparents, and it was passed down through generations. So it was this learnt behavior, and it's something that we haven't really seen that much of a shift through the generations. So I'm going to pass over to Kano now, and he's going to talk a little bit about experiences in the healthcare system.
Righty, everyone. Gonna be honest, I did have an allergic reaction this morning, so if I'm crying, you know what it is. But some of the findings that we had was that many young people highlighted the unfair treatment in healthcare system, highlighting especially the institutionalized racism. And I think, as Naomi covered, it doesn't have to be very direct racism. It could be just the systems that we live in aren't designed for, they're very colonial systems. They're not designed for newly arrived communities or communities that are recently arriving and migrating. Some young people spoke about how they perceived white people had better care, or they received better attention to their problems compared to their other peers, and I think that leads to inequitable care. And I think during COVID, what we found, or what we heard from young people, is that institutional racism has been a thing for many, many years, for generations, but during COVID really got put to the forefront. And we saw that in the ABS data, where in terms of people from different colored skins or people from multicultural backgrounds were more likely to be fatalities due to COVID-19. And I think during this, it also highlights the burden that young people have when it comes to these services when they're accessing. So we hear these quotes, and I want you to read the last one, which is, at the heart of the pandemic, where I felt most concerned about was definitely my parents. Like, they can speak English, but it's not amazing. And we hear these quotes, but what is a real life example? So I'm going to take you back to 2008. So I arrived, I'm a migrant myself. I've been here. I moved with my family back in 2007. We've been living here for about a year. And a very typical migrant story of living in a 2-bedroom house with 13 people, and none of my family could speak English. And so I went to a language school. So a language school is where you go to learn English. It's not mainstream schooling, but it's a part of, normal schooling. And so, I was being like every other kid, playing footy. And then, went to go mark the ball. I fell over. I think I had a shaky tooth. I was like about 8 or 9 then. And it cut my mouth, and I was bleeding. It was bloody. It was very, very bad. And so the kids took me to the sick bay or whatever it was. And then, my face was bloody. It was bad. And so they decided to call up my mum. And my mum, right, she's going to these English classes. She can't speak English. So the only thing she heard on her phone was Kano hurt, fall down. I don't know what, my mum got the gist that something was wrong. And so she got off the tram where she was going to classes, and she made her way back to the school, because at the time, some of the issues that also arise is around accessibility. We don't have a family car. My dad couldn't pick up his phone while he was out working. And so the only person the school could contact was my mum. So my mum comes back, sees my bloody face, and no idea what to do, right? Like, where do we go? And so at the time, we decided to walk from the school to a local GP, because we knew it was for free, healthcare card, Medicare card. So all right, it'll be for free. And the GP is like, all right, you need to get some stitches done. You need to get some proper treatment done. And so guess where they told us to come to? The Royal Children's Hospital. So we arrived here, and they're like, all right, we need it. And again, this is me and my mom. We caught the bus, to come here, because we didn't have access at the time. We lived in around Footscray area, and so we got around. Mom can't speak English. My mouth is bloody. I'm crying as an 8-year-old. I can't speak at the moment, and so I feel like the staff had figured out, there was something wrong, and so they, got me treated. I got some stitches, and all of that was sorted. But after the treatment, I think this is where some of the barriers come in, where this hospital or the staff at the time thought, all right, language barrier, fair enough. So we'll get an interpreter. And so they got obviously I'm Indian. My mom was saying I'm Indian. And so they got an interpreter, and they got a Hindi interpreter. And my background is I'm a Gujarati. India has 1 billion people. And so not everyone speaks Hindi. Luckily, my mom sort of understood Hindi, but at the same time, a bit of background, my mom studied till about grade 5 in India in public education. So she's very, very street smart, clever, but book smart, not so much. And so looking back on that, I'm like, I wish the staff would have, asked a few more questions, or maybe if the interpreter that we got someone from the actual ethnic background. And luckily, from my background, it's not that big of an issue. But recently arriving communities, we have lots of issues with tribalism, even gender. And so I think we can't just get someone from the same country to be an interpreter. We need to look a bit deeper. And That is what leads me into one of the solutions is creating culturally inclusive settings. And that doesn't mean just having more bicultural workers. To get that, we must, and a few of the young people highlighted, that we must develop an understanding of what internalized racism means. It doesn't have to be very direct. It's these other systems that are not made to suit multicultural young people or multicultural communities, families arriving. And we must learn the barriers that exist around, as I talked about, the language barriers, the financial barriers, even the access, not having enough proper transport to come to the hospital, or knowing that you can get free treatment at the hospital, just around that knowledge gaps that are missing. Sometimes we do have to go the extra mile when it comes to these communities, because there's a big between need and want. There's lots of wants in the community, but these newly arrived communities, there's certain communities that need it more. And that does mean we have to allocate more resources, more time to creating these inclusive settings. And I think the big thing that young people highlighted was that they would like a space where they feel welcomed, safe, informed, valued, and supported for. Because in a lot of these spaces, growing up, I was the one that was the interpreter for my mum. I was the one that was taking my parents to parentage interviews. I was the one filling in the medical forms or the custom forms, because I just had to be the one. Even though I was like 10 years old, I didn't know half the thing. But compared to the rest of my family, I was the one that was more educated on the system and in the language. And when we come to healthcare settings, if the young person can't speak, or if the young person has, for example, injured, what's the process in that? And I think that's why we've got to work towards creating culturally inclusive settings. And a few of the young people did highlight that it would be great to get more bicultural workers. And I think the reason is because it creates a familiarity in a conversation. If I see someone from my own culture, it's like, all right, I have a sense of trust. I can trust them that they will look after me. They will understand my cultural norms and the issues that might be going for my community, and they can give me the best service. But that doesn't mean that it's not, the onus is still not on us to fight racism or to create systems that are supportive of everyone. And I think a lot of the young people did highlight that they wish more people knew about these issues, or they were at least aware of what are these barriers that exist. What is this racism, institutionalized racism that exists? And I think just having that knowledge base goes a long way. And that is one of the solutions that we've sort of talked with the young people. And I'd love to pass it on to Alex to discuss a few more.
Yeah, thanks, Kano. And I think that connects really nicely to what I was going to talk about next. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay and see at least my face. Okay. So obviously, having this conversation about solutions, what we'd really like to do is to find ways to prevent racism from happening in the first place. And, I think as some of the work that we've seen so far, some of the points that have been brought up, there's things we can do to work towards that day by day, but it's not going to happen overnight. And the reality is that racism does happen, unfortunately, to the majority of young people from multicultural backgrounds, as you can see by those stats. So it's really important that when it does happen, whether it's interpersonal, systemic, vicarious, any form of racism, that young people are able to be supported. So, like other research in the area, one of the findings from our focus groups was that the aftermath of racism can actually be really hard to deal with, perhaps almost as difficult as the incident itself. Often, after experiencing racism, it can be quite a disempowering sort of position for young people to be in. They may not be sure, who they can talk to. They might feel quite isolated. It is, an inherently isolating experience to feel that you're being othered, to feel that you're, this is not a space for you. And so then to not be sure what they can do or who they can talk to afterwards sort of really can compound that. And, there are sometimes options for reporting incidents, for, seeking some support or perhaps some sort of acknowledgement or redress. But often these systems are not experienced as safe. They can even be experienced as harmful for young people and not really responsive to their needs. And I think that's really strongly reflected in the reality that hardly any young people actually report their experiences of racism. And that's not just young people, that finding is kind of reflected across different age groups as well. In this case, it was just 6% reported experiences. So
yeah, just because we don't hear about racism then doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Clearly it does. And, you know, after experiencing racism, young people, you know, a lot of them mentioned not talking about it at all. And as Kate mentioned, for a lot of them, actually coming to the focus group was the first time that they'd brought up certain instances or felt comfortable to. Some of them mentioned times where, particularly where they'd experienced racism in institutions. I guess something that you might be more interested in this hospital setting, was sort of the complexities and some of the issues with dealing with that. So a couple of people did recall going and talking to, say, teachers or lecturers if the incident happened at a university or at a school. Unfortunately, a lot of those cases, they got quite unsupportive and even harmful responses. It might have just been, you know, not necessarily intentionally harmful, but if the person was a bit dismissive, they didn't quite feel believed, if they were accused of being oversensitive, you know, intentionally or unintentionally, even making things worse. As you can imagine, that probably discouraged them from seeking support again. So another effect, I mean, obviously, sorry, I'll come back to the reporting in a second. Obviously, that's important if we're going to do something about it. But just to delve into this a bit more, another effect is that young people actually started to doubt their own experiences. Young people talked about feeling gaslighted, that word came up a few times, about feeling that perhaps these things were just in their head. And in focus groups, they were often quite hesitant to talk about experiences, unsure whether they were being oversensitive, whether they're doing something a bit wrong, maybe by like complaining, or perhaps anticipating that, you know, we might be dismissive as well, so that, you know, minimizing their experiences quite a lot. And in some cases, they even wondered, you know, oh, maybe it was just something that I did accidentally to provoke the perpetrator. Maybe they thought I was being rude. What's quite striking about this is that this was particularly the case for instances of racism that were quite small, they were quite ambiguous, something really confronting, you know, obviously direct, overt racism is also really bad, but we shouldn't minimize the impact of these smaller, more ambiguous incidents because they were really quite confusing for young people and quite disempowering. So on a more positive note, when they did share their experiences and when they were supported by the focus group, the result was overwhelmingly really positive. And one of the strongest bits of feedback we got from participants that it was incredibly valuable to have a space where they felt listened to and they felt believed by people who could empathize with them. It really seemed to give them confidence as well to sort of own these experiences and to recognize that, yes, racism had happened, that was bad, and no, it wasn't just in their head or it wasn't really to do with them. A useful way to think about this, if you're not already thinking about it, is perhaps in a similar way to existing frameworks and practices around responding to disclosures of abuse and assault. You know, while young people won't necessarily disclose experiences of racism to you, it's still really important to foster an environment where they feel listened to and where they feel heard and where they feel believed. And this might mean that young people will feel comfortable to open up and share their experiences if they want to, and then you'll be able to support them. But, you know, even if not, it still really reflects the need for safe and supportive sort of spaces, as Kana mentioned. More generally, it's still, you know, being in this environment where they can feel listened to and believed can still be a really positive thing that can build some of the trust that might have been broken and hopefully counter some of the negative experiences they may have had, whether it's hopefully not here, but could be here or could just be in other areas of their lives. You know, that relationship with the institution is not something that, you know, would always feel safe at their schools or in other places where they are. So to come somewhere where they do feel like they have people in positions of authority and care who actually listen rather than just dismiss their feelings, as was powerfully said, you know, that can be really valuable. So just super briefly, because I think I'm running out of time, Kate, can you give me like a 2-minute warning? Thanks. The next main possible solution that young people talked about was the importance of bystanders. So I have mentioned that for many, the aftermath of a racist encounter could be experienced as really harmful, but, you know, that wasn't always the case. And the main difference there was whether was bystanders, whether anyone said or did anything to acknowledge that what had happened wasn't okay. So in the vast majority of experiences, there were other people around who could see what was happening. And when no one said anything, that sent a message to participants that everyone around them, and in some cases, maybe even everyone in Australia, accepted or even agreed with what was happening. But where people spoke up, whether directly to the perpetrator or just to check in on them afterwards, it had a really powerful impact, making participants feel like they weren't alone. And this kind of thing isn't just important dealing with one-off experiences of racism. For young people, racism is, as we've seen, experienced as an ongoing kind of burden that they deal with in their day-to-day lives. So bystander stepping in and saying that that's not okay actually represents them stepping in and taking a small part of that overall burden and doing some of that work. And that was probably the strongest message that came through in this research, was that the burden of addressing racism needs to be shared. It shouldn't be put back onto the same racialized people who are victimized by it. You know, often we might look to people who've experienced racism to teach us about it, to educate us, or we might expect them to call it out or be community leaders. And they do a lot of that work, but they shouldn't really have to. You know, it's very tiring and it is hard work. So yeah, the way that we respond to instances of racism is important as bystanders, but we can also do other things that can sort of take on some of that burden or help to share that burden, even if it's just as simple as educating ourselves about experiences of racism. And that goes for people even who haven't experienced racism themselves, maybe especially. We need to be aware of the ways in which, you know, racism happens, and also the ways in which people who are racialized are kind of expected to pick up that work and solve that problem. And if we're sort of aware of that, then we can do what we can to reduce that burden, create culturally safe and inclusive spaces, as Kana was saying, educate ourselves and respond to what we can ourselves. I guess I'll just say lastly, I suppose it's also important to keep in mind, you know, not just for young people, but, you know, in this institution, who is seen as responsible or who does this kind of work, and is that work appreciated and is it shared? That's something that we should sort of all be thinking about, I think. But yeah, basically, this is sort of everyone's problem, so I guess it should be everyone's solution, was the message that came through. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to move, we do have this video, but this is just a taster for you to watch afterwards. I think we'll move to questions, but this will be all online from tomorrow, I think, usually the next day or two on the Grand Rounds website. If any of you have got eagle eyes on your phones, you can take a photo of the link down there and watch the video. This is a video put together by the Maikuai team to sit alongside the Lancet paper, and has a number of Aboriginal people talking about their own experiences and solutions. So yeah, that ends our part of the talk. Yeah, can hand it back to you, Trevor, and for questions, or do you want us to just like take questions? We can do it. I think Kano's going to do the roving mic. I think we've run out of time. It's 20 past. Yeah, it's 7 minutes. What do you want, video or questions?
The video, why don't we run the video?
Okay.
for a video?
Yeah.
Let's go, Ollie. Yeah, go races, mate.
Racism is shit. It's silencing.
Racism makes us sick.
I don't think people understand how much racism breaks our spirit. We have to armour up every day when we leave our house, and You know, we go into spaces where we're not safe. It's tiring and it's mentally exhausting, and that has huge impacts on our well-being.
It's impacted my family's lived experience. It's impacted the way they were cared for. So when I talk about that, people forget that it was not ancient long ago. It's really complex and it's really deep and it's ongoing.
Racism takes away opportunities that rightfully should have been there. So if I think about my grandparents, through racism, they weren't allowed the opportunities that mainstream Australia received.
For me, racism is unjust. It's wrong, it's hurtful. We know it's intentional and designed to not only oppress and suppress certain people, but it's disguised in many different ways.
Racism is harmful and it's traumatic and it's bullshit.
It's a physical assault on your body.
Yeah, it's violence. It's traumatic and it's heavy. You feel it in your chest and you carry it around with you.
Racism is traumatic, destructive and divisive. No human being on this planet would want to tap into those emotions, yet we as Australia live in that environment every single day.
Blue sky thinking, a world without racism for me is having a world where culture is front and centre. And that's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Indigenous Australians as well, and all types of people.
It's about how people feel, and that process of not having to feel pain, I think, is what we're trying to get to. We can talk about the end goals, which I think we need to, but I think the process of living without pain is what the world looks like without racism.
A world without racism would mean my kids can go safely outside of our house and not have to feel like they don't belong in their own country. It means we don't have to armour up when we leave our house.
It means that my kids know their language, that our ways of knowing and being is centre. It's not been silenced.
If we didn't have racism, we'd have less mental health issues, we'd have less trauma, and we could just grow to be who we're meant to be.
It'd be lighter, like, you know, you're not carrying this bag around on your back. You're not being this shapeshifter. You can just be yourself.
Free from the burden of what it is, the heaviness of it.
Yeah.
Harmonious, happy. A world without racism would be a lot easier to navigate. Wouldn't be perfect. We all face challenges, but you know, it would be a world where we didn't have a feeling of our backs are against a wall.
A world without racism would be freedom. It would be dropping the chains that, you know, hold us back, and we would be able to thrive. And yeah, it'd be bloody deadly.
And freaking productive. Can you imagine how much time you'd have on your hands if we weren't having to deal with all of the shit that we have to deal with all the time?
A world without racism for me would be my future children knowing who they are and being comfortable in who they are.
It's not unachievable either. I think it is something that we can and should be working towards, and I'm not here to have a world with a little bit of racism. Like, I'm here to have a world with no racism.
Whew.
Big question.
Big question. To get there, it can't just be a ground up sort of approach. It has to be all different ways. It has to be top down. It has to be laterally with allies.
I think we have to be brave and be bold, and to address colonisation, in my opinion, is to address racism directly.
It has to be real, genuine conversation around getting down to the truth of the effects that it's had on our people.
Education is where we can, seeking to understand somebody, rather than me saying, hey, you need to know that we are the rulers of this land and so forth, and people taking that in a way where we butt heads, but more so, hey, this is what we're about.
We get there by everybody doing their share of the work. It's work, it's hard work. And I know we're doing our share of the work. And I think the action needs to be, like, it can only be driven by us. And I think, you know, I hear a lot about, you know, mob getting a seat at the table, but like, I think we're beyond just a simple seat. Like, we need to be the ones that have made the table and have decided who's at the table. And
There's 10,000 voices. We're all saying the same thing. Like, no one can discount it anymore. You know, so I think, yes, it is timely. And now with the data behind it, to actually say, well, here is the strategy, like this is the solution.
I think, you know, there's a lot in terms of power imbalance in this country. You know, non-Indigenous people, they may not be aware necessarily of that power and that privilege.
Well, I think it's also about being able to hear with an open heart and an open mind too. Walk alongside us, you know, and do the learning with us.
We want you to come into the conversation and say, was there something bad that actually happened? Educate yourself on it. And you can say, was it good or bad? And once you say that was bad, then what can you do as an individual to create change where it becomes good?
I think it needs to be something that all Australians address at the dinner table, at the pub, if you're on a bus, being a good ally, and then also voting yes in the referendum is also a bigger one.
To non-Indigenous people, I think the time has passed. We've been talking about this for too long, and it's on you to make a change.
It is hard work, but I guess just know that, like, we're behind you, we're beside you, we're in front of you.
How I would want a non-Indigenous person to change the system would be to encourage minorities, or in our case, Indigenous people, encourage them to get into those positions of leadership, because it's through them that the whole system can change.
Well, thank you, Naomi and Alex and Kate and Kano for your presentations today. And thanks for the video, because I think the video addressed a lot of the questions that people might actually ask. We probably have a minute or so before we have to finish. We've got a couple of minutes. Are there any questions for our speakers today? Yes, please. Yeah, well, actually, yeah. Oh, geez.
Look, thank you, everybody. I'm so glad you played the video because it brought up a lot of emotion, and I sit here as a white, privileged and born to advantage person, but I feel very deeply watching this and the patients who are coming through our doors, and we have to do better, and we need to do better, and we need to do it now. And I'm wondering, as a hospital and as a community, you know, what is our statement on racial justice and bias? And if we do have one, I'm embarrassed that I don't know where it is, but if we don't have one, I'm embarrassed that we don't have it. And I would call on the leadership of this organisation, which is wonderful in many, many respects, and working towards it, to make sure that we are living, breathing, doing, acting and educating about racial diversity. So that is a comment, a very long one, I'm sorry, but there is a question in there. Do people know, do we have a racial injustice statement in the hospital?
We'll find out.
We'll find out. And look, I really sincerely thank you. It's I work in the trauma service, and we have shared concerns amongst us for quite some time with the patients who come through our door. We have very little ethnic identity as to who they are. And we focus on our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders families, make sure they've got the right resources in place. But we would love some advice on how we can make sure those minority groups are not, you know, treated to further racism throughout our system. Because looking at those figures there, you've got 80% of children, young people, stating they've got, and I'm asking, how can we do better and what can we do? Thank you.
Thank you for those comments and really, now I can't even get the microphone to work. I'll see if I can actually talk and walk at the same time. I may not be able to achieve that. With regards to the statement, I mean, I think it would be great to see a similar statement, an Australian one from relevant peak bodies like the, I have to stand over there, do I? I'm trying to multitask here, it's a bit too much for me. Like the American Academy of Pediatrics, but to have a local statement too. But yeah, be really keen to continue in conversation with you about that. Any other questions?
I think Helen's question also speaks to the importance of practical things that can be done in different services. So I think it's very relevant. Yeah.
And obviously it's going to be different in the trauma service, isn't it, to ED, to, you know, we need to have tailored solutions. And yeah, working in with young people to co-design those, yeah.
I think often we can see perhaps racism, systemic racism in other people's services, but I think it's harder to see it in our own. I could give some examples of systemic racism within the police, and you gave the example of the closure of the lockdowns at the towers. I thought a very good example of somewhere where all Victorians could see that had some racial elements to it, but it's harder to see it in our own service perhaps.
Yeah, and something that certainly we do a lot of work in schools, actually making it a conversation that's allowed to happen, I think is a really, you know, talking about it. Racism is something that we can talk about, having, you know, whether it's posters or whether it's being part of conversations in the trauma service, so that we can then hear from communities, yeah, when those experiences of racism might be happening. And I happen to know because Kate just showed me the computer, someone's asked in the chat about how do we capture that at a systemic level and at an administrative level. And yeah, it absolutely needs to be included in reporting. There's some great work coming out of the UK. They've actually, during COVID, set up a race health observatory, which has a major focus on tracking ethnic inequalities, but also racism within the healthcare system. And there is some work happening. It's part of the Close the Gap target to address racism within the healthcare system. So, you know, we often have metrics like failure to attend or discharge against medical advice, which can sometimes be proxies actually for systemic issues, but the issue is then put onto families. So yeah, being able to capture those experiences, I think, again, it has to be setting specific, doesn't it? Yeah.
It does. Now, my apologies, Kate, there's lots of people online. Has anyone got any questions? No, that's been answered, thanks. Any other questions that people might have? No, well, I think we've learnt a lot today, and we thank you for your work and for the research you do and the empowerment of young people and what we can learn from them. And hopefully we can learn something from you about our service and our hospital and the way we do things. So please join me in thanking Naomi and Kate and Alex and Kano for a wonderful talk today. Thanks.